start it and just stop it when I finish talking, and then I think Kevin and Marianne can take over, and then we can do the moderated component of
Okay,
it.
if I let it go too long, or if it goes past the point where you want me to go, just turn your camera on, come on, and say, okay, that's enough. So,
Wonderful.
thank you. We're about a minute
And
and a
I'll
half.
start with a few words.
Okay,
I'll start with an introduction too, and then I'll just point it over to you, Bob. Start the video.
thank you. We're about 1 minute out from scheduled start.
This is Symposium Hall 3, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for coming to this session. My name is Kevin Chetek. On behalf of the OHBM Student Postdoc Special Interest Group, I'd like to welcome you to this workshop, which is the Neuroimaging Best Practices Beyond Open Science, Ethics, Collaborations, and High Quality Research. Our speaker today is Dr. Satra Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh is a principal research scientist at the McGovern Institute for Brain Research at MIT, an assistant professor in the Department of Otolaryngology at Harvard Medical School, and a faculty member in the Speech and Hearing Bioscience and Technology program in the Harvard Division of Medical Sciences. He directs a sensible intelligence group, which brings together speech, brain imaging, and informatics to address gaps in scientific knowledge related to speech and clinical applications, to machine learning for personalized medicine, and neuroinformatics and reproducible research. Satra has been an important contributor to and advocate for open science in the human brain mapping community for over a decade. And he's always eager to talk about issues in science, no matter how big or how small, and he's just as eager to propose solutions, especially if they involve collaborations. And on a personal note, this openness, collaborativeness, and excitement for science is what led me to Satra's lab as an early PhD student nearly 8 years ago, and I couldn't be more grateful for my experience working with him. So we'll get started here with a short video summary, and then we'll move on to the question and answer portion of this session. So please let us know if you have any questions for Dr. Ghosh in the chat.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Roundtable on Best Practices in Neuroimaging, Collaborations, Big Data, and Ethics. And the way it's supposed to work, I'm supposed to reintroduce what I talked about in the video a little bit for a little bit of time, and then open it up to a Q&A session where I will get the questions. And I hear there might be a little delay between the Sparkle platform and what I'm doing right now. So we'll take it as it goes as we talk about these topics. So when I was asked to talk about this, they asked me to talk about kind of three areas: key ethical principles when working with collaborative teams and open data, working with open science teams to improve the workflow of open science, and best practices in data analysis and data sharing with the specific intent of keeping in mind researchers who may use the data or code after. And these were broad enough that I called it the Neuroverse. So here we go into the Neuroverse. Collaborations are essential for science and have been a big part of my lab's culture when I was in grad school and has continued since then. And I'm really happy to have the privilege and luxury of working with many individuals. So these collaborations have shaped my thinking and approach to science, as well as increased exposure of science and tools, welcome new individuals to contribute, and sustain many things when resources were tight. But I also see this through this lens of this phrase, community of practice, which is a group of people who share a concern or passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. And it is really this kind of community of practice that has given rise in this vast landscape of neuroscience to have spearheaded so many open data resources in neuroimaging and neuroscience more broadly. Most of you are quite familiar probably with Open Neuro as a data resource, the UK Biobank, the Child Mind Institute, and the Human Connectome Project. But there are many other resources coming online. So we're living in an era of plenty in many ways across the spectrum of neuroscience. This has resulted in a large number of publications for mining such data, and it raises questions a little bit in the lab culture of whether one should be collecting new data, whether one should be focused on reanalyzing or analyzing new things out of data that's already available. And we can discuss some of this. And this led to a set of questions in this kind of sense of ethical principles of data sharing or working with collaborative teams. So I'll put out some of these questions out there. Doesn't this availability of open data immediately benefit only those who have access to resources, i.e. labs with greater compute capabilities or cloud credits, or personnel to be able to mine these rich resources? Is the science that is derived representative of and beneficial to the population? Are we biasing our results through the biases of these data sets? What kind of exposure do we need to understand what these data are representative of? Should there be a community say in what data sets should be collected and shared? And for clinical data, should there be an equitable focus on rare disorders versus major disorders? And one of the things I realized as I had kind of put the talk together was that I missed out on a whole lot of things. So I'm going to introduce a couple of new things for this session. And one of them was something that Tom Johnstone from Australia pointed me out to, which are the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. And this is really a nice way to kind of think about beyond fair, right? As they say, be fair and care. How does the availability of data support collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics? And in the context of this particular thing, which was focused on Indigenous peoples, collective benefit meant data ecosystems shall be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous peoples to derive benefit from data. Authority to control is the Indigenous people's rights and interests in Indigenous data must be recognized and their authority to control such data be empowered. Indigenous governance enables Indigenous peoples and governing bodies to determine how Indigenous peoples, as well as Indigenous lands, territories, resources, knowledges, and geographical indicators are represented and identified within the data. For those working with Indigenous data, and this is where responsibility comes in, they have a responsibility to share how those data are used to support indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. Accountability requires meaningful and open and available evidence of these efforts and the benefits accruing to Indigenous peoples. And ethics, Indigenous people's rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of data lifecycle and across the data ecosystem. Now, we don't think necessarily of all of these issues as we reuse open data everywhere. And these are some of the things, while focused on Indigenous peoples, I think things that we should be thinking about as we leverage the tremendous abundance of open data and as we think about how to share data. And this brings me to another topic that I failed to touch on. One of my favorite kind of organizations and community is the Open Humans community. And the intent behind Open Humans is to explore, analyze, and donate your data as a person and doing research together. So the idea of personal data stores kind of comes into play over here, which is that you put your data and you give access to people who request access. So it goes through a different mechanism of thinking about how to share data openly, how to create communities that look at this data together. And one such example within Open Humans is the Nobism community, which Nobism, for those of you who don't know, is related to cluster headaches. And this was a community put together to try and figure out solutions that work for people. And it was set up by Roger Koenig. It all started before even getting pain-free with 8 years of almost chronic cluster headache attacks. And so he came up with a solution for himself, and he thought, could this help others? And this is the kind of thing we should be thinking about in the broader ecosystem of neuroimaging, which is not only understanding the basic science of neurobiology, but also thinking about how that science translates to cures and interventions for other folks. And another example of a community of practice is the Open APS community, where APS is the artificial pancreas system. So this was a community that came together as a community of practice to reduce the burden of type 1 diabetes. And within this context, they came together to design hardware systems, to design control systems, to understand the benefits within the community to solve problems for themselves. And as noted in the bottom of this slide, this is a statement directly from their website. Please note that the Open APS community efforts will be open source and free to use for other people, open source projects, researchers, and nonprofits to use, and available on an open and non-discriminatory basis for all commercial manufacturers to use in proprietary products if desired. Excuse me. And this gives a sense of the openness of the community and brings me to the second component of the talk on open science. And I couldn't say the word open science without a ping to a dear friend, Tal Yarkoni's website, where he put this provocative essay out there called I Hate Open Science. And I do agree with him that it's ambiguous and that the term has evolved into a catch-all phrase for many things: transparency, access, inclusivity, reproducibility, and discourse. But I've never thought of it as an identity, which was one of his key criticisms of open science. Over the years, I've been part of, as I've said earlier, to improve science through various communities of practice and to share a belief that such improvement can come through greater transparency, access, inclusivity, reproducibility, and discourse. So imagine the following. I'm listing a lot of open science software over here, open software that people can use for various things. Now, imagine the software did not exist. How would science be different today? And I would argue that this kind of team science, being able to do things together, has enriched our space of doing science and increased the support that we have in investigation of human brains. Open science also means open discourse and open discussion. And this is an example of Neurostars, an open community platform for people to come and ask questions. A lot of the questions are currently dominated by answers or questions about how to use software. But in general, we see this as something that comes up as a place for discussion to preserve information. And that's part of open science too, is that the thought process, the discourse should also be preserved. And it should drive us towards kind of consensus on what we agree and disagree on so that we can try to figure out solutions to our disagreements. It would also tell us where information is missing and what steps could be taken to resolve both the differences for disagreements and how to tackle some of these places where information is missing. So open allows feedback, dissemination, participation, investigating failures, education, and clarity of challenges. Being closed keeps all of these out. And I would love to kind of discuss and think about these things of what open does allow. Maybe we can also talk about what open doesn't allow as one of the issues over here. And the final thread that I touched on in the video was this idea of best practices, but best practices with this focus on how to make things better for the downstream user of either analytics or code. Now, I couldn't talk about best practices without pulling out this cartoon. Uh, as is said over here, we'll be adopting best practices in our industry just like everyone else. If everybody is doing it, best practices is the same thing as mediocre. Stop making mediocrity sound bad. Now, one of the things that comes to my head when I think about the term best practices is, does it mean that there are no other better practices? Or really, are we talking about what we consider good practices at this point in time? And the community has created a lot of good practices. Let's just ensure that when we think about good practices, we don't think about crazy ways to do things that could have been done quite reasonably, but instead kind of focus on ways in which the community can really embrace some of these efforts towards better practices. And one such effort, it's the brain imaging data structure. It has become the de facto standard for organization of data in many neuroimaging labs, with the standard continuing to evolve to support more modalities of data. But this really grew out of user and community needs. And as is said over here, it reflects in many ways the shared values, aspirations, and responsibilities we as a society project upon each other and our world. And it's one of these community elements of BIDS that's really powerful. It brings in a set of people looking to solve problems. And that takes me to this slide. One way of improving sharing for others is to think about the bottlenecks you may have faced at different stages of doing research and thinking how you would have improved those steps. Sometimes there's already a solution out there, and that's why we need open discussions. At other times, evaluating your own challenges and talking to people often results in tools that we now use routinely today. In fact, the BIDS ecosystem is a direct example of that effort. So think about your past and future self, your collaborators, your students. These are the kinds of people you need to provide data or tools to. For those of you who are just starting out, reach out and ask. I also missed when I was doing the video that within the OHBM community, there is now a best practices group, working group, that focuses on improving best practices related to neuroimaging and neuroscientific practices within the human brain mapping community. So reach out to us if you want to contribute to best practices, if you want to start an initiative that focuses on best practices, and even thinking about best practices for future data sharing and code reuse would be something that would be welcome as a community to improve. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to put this slide up there, which kind of refers back to the theme of this roundtable: the ethics of team science and open data, improving open science practices collaboratively, and best practices for reuse of shared analytics and code. And I'll stop sharing, and I hope to take questions through the Sparkle interface that you're attending to, and they'll be channeled to me through some magical electronic means.
Thank you so much for this great presentation, Dr. Ghosh. It was truly amazing. I learned a lot listening to your talk, and I'm sure many others in the audience did too. So we will now be taking questions from the chat. And if I may, I have one too. So we talked a lot about the benefits of open data, and I was curious to hear your thoughts on the costs of making these data open and creating these big initiatives in the scientific community. Because from my understanding, creating large and open data sets takes a lot of time and costs a lot of resources. And I wonder if sometimes people decide not to get involved in these initiatives because they get discouraged. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the subject or ideas about how we could optimize or encourage open data within the scientific community.
Wonderful question. And let me start by just thanking the student and postdoc SIG for inviting me to talk about this. It's a pleasure to have both Kevin here and Marianne. And so let me kind of start with the cost. I think for some of the resources that I pointed to, they are kind of run out of very large initiatives that are funded by various national brain initiatives. The UK Biobank, the ABCD study, the Human Connectome project, all of these are kind of funded through NIH or other resources in various countries. And that's great. But I think one of the things that you could look at is something like Open Neuro, where a lot of the data sets that are put into Open Neuro come from various labs, right? Each data set on their own is not this giant data set like the UK Biobank. But by putting things in there across different projects and labs, you're accumulating a lot of diversity of data, which I think is good for science. And therefore, in response to your direct question on if people feel that there's a bottleneck for them to kind of contribute, I think Open Neuro would be a good example, where there are data sets that have 5 people, and there are data sets that have 100 people, and there are data sets which are one person scanned for 30 days. So there are many ways in which one could contribute data to and I think the key is to think about doing that as you're thinking about a project, because you're very likely to find data relevant to your project. So your first step now might be, is there data available that I can analyze? And if not, I might look to collect such data. And I have in my screen in front of me a person, Kevin, who had to go and collect data because that kind of data was not available on one side. And on the other side, he was able to leverage existing data that was made available by other people. So I think those are both available to many people today, and it has completely changed the dynamics, I think, of how a student or a postdoc can approach science. And Kevin will know that at least in this OHBM, there was a presentation of a very large human ex vivo data set or collection that's being put out by the University of Oxford.
Thank you for this
Thank
great
you,
answer.
Satra. Yeah. So I guess to sort of change gears a little bit. So say you're working with somebody who's not quite as, so you would like to share some data that you're collecting, but you're interacting with a collaborator, or maybe they're even primarily collecting the data and you're coming in as a secondary collaborator, and they're less open to sharing the data that's a part of the project. How do you interact? How do you navigate that sort of relationship in order to try to make things as open as possible?
That's a great question. I wonder where that was coming from. But one of the things that I think one can do is be transparent about how you like to see the world around you. And I think that's useful for any collaboration. Kind of getting out there to your collaborators, I don't publish in journal X, or I like to share things openly. Those are things that I have been able to do throughout my life, and this is just a personal story. And I think in many cases, people have come around to more open sharing through a collaboration as a result of it. But at the same time, you have to respect a few things, which is the person who's agreed to give you data has put in the effort to collect that data. And therefore, at least from that perspective, it's their data, their rights to how they want to distribute it. And I think as much as I would like everything to be open, I won't go about imposing all the pieces that I would see if I were to collect my own data. So I think that's a relationship building thing of how you approach. And I think that's true of any collaboration, not just one that might be on secondary data analysis. And I think if you approach that with an open mindset of saying, this is what I would like, but I'm willing to listen to you about what your thoughts are, and is there some middle ground? That's often a way when many things do happen. But I think key part of collaboration is that you're still trying to get science done, right? You're trying to get something out. And that's what really drives a lot of the thinking behind a collaboration. And eventually one might, just through the natural act of building a relationship, especially for new collaborations, you will find that people had certain stances, and by the time you're done with the collaboration, there's a completely different stance related to it. So you can hold the optimistic view that things could change, but also hold the restricted view that this was a collaboration, this is not my data, and I'm going to respect the owner of the data and the wishes they have.
Yeah, that's a really good point, especially because, yeah, you're not always trying to change the world every single second, but rather sort of laying some groundwork so that you can make your views and preferences clear, and that'll sort of contribute down the line to making things better next time. Yeah. So when you're starting a new project, what is the typical way that you like to go about it? Do you like to start with the seeing what open data are available and sort of letting that drive your interest? Or do you tend to come to your own questions and then really seek out the data that best answers those questions?
I think both of those things. Because sometimes when you see the data, you come up with questions. You realize that I had these questions and they're suddenly there available now because the data set has become available. I was talking to Conrad Cording just the other day about this new data archive that we are running called Dandy. It's a cellular neurophysiology archive, not brain neuroimaging, but cellular neurophysiology. And one of the thought process that we were considering is, could people come and simply say what questions they would like to ask of such data? Not use the data, but simply come to it and say, given what the data is, here are some possible questions I would like to ask. And I think that's the kind of science we could do more generally about any data set, is come and say, because we don't have the time and bandwidth to answer all those questions. But we could come and say, here are some questions, here are some interesting questions, and that would result in two things. Either that data supports those questions, or there's another data set that's somewhere else that supports those questions, or there is no data that supports those questions. And all of those are interesting options with respect to a question, but it then drives everything through this lens of, I have a scientific question, and I'm going to try and answer it with the data at hand. And that, I think, is a good way to think about all these open resources that are coming online today. Hope that answers your question, Kevin.
Yeah, and just a bit of a follow-up, which, yeah, I guess maybe you've answered through this, but if you have any other thoughts about how you decide on which resources you're going to use for a given project, seeing as how there are so many massive, large data sets, how do you pick the best one?
I don't know what best would mean. So the way I would look at it is there information that's related to the question I'm asking? Uh, I think thanks to all the collaborators I have, I'm lucky enough in some ways to know many of these resources. But every day there is a huge social network out there of neuroscientists and neuroimagers who can help answer questions. So even if you did not know there's a resource, you can ask the question. And I think that's one of the things that I would highly convey to everyone is there are channels like Mattermost, there is places like Neurostars, there is Twitter, where if you so desire, you can go and ask the question as well. And there is a community of people who will respond to it. So leverage kind of that globally connected space of information. And if you have a question that you may not know whether there exists a data set, go ask someone. I think I've always found that through some form of connection over my research span, that for anything, through somebody would have got me close to a data set. A lot of things are being made public which are easily accessible. You should be aware of them. You should know what kinds of resources there are. But as with publications, right, I can't follow or track all the neuroimaging publications that are put out. It's impossible. So you do search, right? You go to Google Scholar and search for it, or the Biomed Explorer, and maybe that's a new resource many people have not heard. It was opened up last year for COVID-related papers, and then it was opened up further for any scholarly search. And one of the nice things, unlike Google Scholar search, is you can actually export all the results out as a table. So there are resources popping up that's making life easier. So ask questions either socially or use some of the technology that's out there.
Okay, so we're just taking a peek to see if any questions have come in so far. Doesn't seem like they have, but I have a few more on my end. So some potential criticisms have sometimes been voiced, I think probably less in recent years, about how public data might be biasing some of our results if we have so many people who are working on the same data sets, and they're all acquired with the same acquisition scheme. So even if you're asking different questions, there could be some sort of acquisition bias or some other bias at some other level in the pre-processing or something like that. So what is your advice for dealing with how public data and analysis could be biasing some overall scientific findings? Do you think that's a big issue, or do you think it's something that we need to address in any particular way?
I think some aspects of that is absolutely valid criticism. With many of these, we're still looking at the tip of the iceberg in terms of the total amount of data that's generated around the planet and what's openly available. Further, in many settings, people already curate that data a lot more. So imagine if there was a clinical population which was more likely to have motion in the scanner, and you kept the bad data out. You're reducing the diversity that comes along, even if that was bad data that comes out there. That bad data can be good for certain things for people to look at. And so I think we have to look at this through the lens of how do we increase diversity and approach that the people of the world are being represented in these data sets that are coming out. And that's not quite the case right now. It's heavily biased towards certain types of populations. We can still learn a lot from this, but we have to, as a community, continue to embrace ways in which we increase the diversity of data that's accessible. I'm not going to say necessarily openly, but at least accessible. And there are many reasons and many places where data is behind a wall for protection, but you can get to it through data use agreements or other kinds of approaches. In terms of the kinds of science that are being done, I think there is usually a lot to mine from many data sets. And so the question becomes, are people doing the same kinds of things? And one example is from a paper last year on the variability of fMRI analysis, right? This was the competition, the NARPS competition that was run, where multiple teams analyzed the same data set and the same hypotheses, but were allowed to use any set of tools that they wanted to use. And that kind of showed that there's variability and diversity in just the approach, right? Everything else is the same. The scientific questions were the same. The data set they were looking at was the same, but yet they came up with slightly different results depending on the tools and settings. And this reminds me of a quote, I think it was from Niels Bohr. An expert is someone who knows all the way how to break things. And we haven't learned all the ways we can break things yet. And this is why we want to keep exploring to understand ways in which things don't work. So I would say, let people work together. I think one of the nice things is the open data allows for different ways in which people look at the same thing, and that's a good thing. It also allows for consolidation within the community in the sense that it would be nice if there was a single pre-processing thing that worked for all kinds of data sets. And if the community could agree on that, then we've taken some level of variability out, right? Because we've understood it. We haven't reached that spot here because we don't know how to evaluate whether this was the really right kind of processing for the right kind of application. We're not there yet, but hopefully I'm sincerely hoping that in the next 5 to 10 years we'll make some inroads towards consolidation of workflows, which will reduce this analytical variability into well-established processes, so we don't have to question those. And then you can look at analytical variability on downstream processes from there, where you're still kind of figuring out how best to do things.
Great, thank you for this answer. So we have a comment in the chat. So the person is saying, I also worry if public data biases future public data. That is, big famous group X made this data acquisition decision, therefore let's do the same thing. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I'm happy to just touch on it. I think anything that exposes biases downstream products from it, right? Think of a publication. When people are writing the discussion, writing the interpretation of the results, they're looking back at the history of things related to that domain. And in some cases, they would have computational theories. In many cases, there are kind of associations that are similar to, oh, this region showed up in my analysis, and this region has been reported to be active in all of these cognitive tasks. And at that point, they cite papers that reflect those activations. So in some sense, you're pulling up on literature that shows those things. Now think of all the studies that did not make it into publications that may have shown that that region was activated in other kinds of things. So I think anything that's put out there creates bias in some sense. It's up to us as a community to kind of figure out how do we understand the diversity of approaches. And this, I think, goes back a little bit to Kevin's question earlier, in that we have to be good stewards to say that diversity is being represented. And whether it's sequences or people, we have to kind of see what those are. But in some cases, again, a community could have come and said, we've evaluated 100 sequences, we've narrowed it down to 3, right? And this is good enough. Now what you're challenging is not whether more diverse sequences that are being used, you're challenging the assumptions or the thought process or the decisions they used to narrow it down to those 3 sequences. So that's where I think the intellectual or the scientific discussion should be, is did they take the right decision rather than they're only using 3 sequences.
Very interesting. And I really liked what you said earlier about, your research questions driving the data you're going to use and not the other way around. And I was wondering, do you still have some tools or resources that you like to use better that you would like to share with the audience, or are you very versatile in terms of the tools and resources you use usually?
So that reminds me of a session that a local kind of meeting used to run. It was called the Hammer and Nail session. And the idea behind the Hammer and Nail session was that people would come there, the tool builders, and the people who had questions that they needed solutions to. And they would go up on a drawing board and they would put down, here's the set of tools we built, here's the set of questions we have. And then they would kind of draw lines, and then they would select pairs, and they would come up and talk about things. And I like that idea a lot, because I think in many cases, we often use very large or a hammer for almost every nail we see. And what a couple of things we have built in our portfolio of tools over the years are precisely that notion of you can choose a tool that's suited or most suited to the question you have. And I would say this requires thinking about the question and the solution, right? The tool that you might be using to answer that question. And I think both are equivalent in their complexity sometimes, that you want to consider both together. That being said, there are a lot of tools out there that do similar things and have variation. And this is the place where that NARP study or things like that could be used to your advantage. Do these tools that do similar things give me the same kind of output? Knowing that we don't have a gold standard for many things in neuroimaging. And that might also be a good way of exploring the space of scientific diversity of questions or answers to questions.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so how do you, as someone who develops some tools yourself, how do you decide when it's time to just iterate on something that's already existing, or to turn around and build an entirely new tool, or something that's a little bit different than what's already out there?
I think the biggest thing that we have used over the years is a sense of community. So many tools we have built, some of them are about making other tools accessible to other people through a different way. And so one of these examples is a tool called NiPipe, which we have built over the years. It kind of today forms the backbone of a lot of pre-processing and other toolkits out there. And that was created because we initially got a grant to distribute an algorithm across different software packages. After we got it, we were like, that was a terrible idea. It would be really hard for us to maintain this for all these other tools. What if we brought all the other tools through a common interface? And that was how that thought process was born. So NiPipe as a whole does not generate by itself new tools. It can generate new workflows, which are new tools, but it brought together a community of tools that people got access to. So that's one example. Another example is we're doing a project on deep learning right now. We're building this tool called NoBrainer. And again, the world of deep learning is extensive. There are many people building toolkits and other things. And that question about why did we start yet another toolkit kind of came up. And to us, the solution or the answer to that was an engineering answer, which is we wanted something that was efficient, that allowed us to explore a space of things efficiently, and allowed us to create a framework within which we could build other tools. So we are, alongside the tool that we're building, also building what's called a zoo, which starts collecting tools built by other people. So these are the two ways I can think of in which, one, we're building things because we do need something better for certain things, and that did not exist. So it was a hole that we needed to fill. The other piece was, while we were filling the hole, there are also other people filling the holes. So can we bring that group of people together to start collecting all the holes that were filled with the tools? And maybe someday we'll get to a common library, but it at least starts getting people together to talk about the ways in which they've approached this. For this might be a too young a generation, but VI and Emacs, tabs and spaces, there are sometimes things that you don't have any rational decision making over, and I'm probably making a sacrilegious statement right now to many people out there. But there are sometimes you buy into something just because of the infrastructure and the other pieces that are there right now. And that's how you build certain pieces. The ideal world would be we come together and build something together that works for everyone. But funding and other things come at different points in times. There are different life cycles. And so that necessarily kind of comes to, we build certain things. I think the bigger question is when to stop, to walk away. And that's a much harder thing to do. Because you've invested resources into something, it's much harder to say, I'm done with this, I'm go away. And I think that's a mental concept one has to be prepared with, given all the different things that people are building today. That at some point in time you say, this is good enough, this was used, there's a better thing out there, I'm going to stop and I'm going to start using that thing. And we've done that in places as well. And so I think that might be the mentality more than the building mentality that is useful to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Since we are the student and postdoc SIG, I did want to ask a little bit trainee-focused questions. So back to like using these large data sets or tools, how do you respond to criticism that maybe using other people's data makes it harder for trainees to really learn a tool in depth, right? If you don't have to go out and collect your own MRI data, then you might argue that maybe you won't learn all of the intricacies of that tool and then really become an expert in it. Do you think that's true? Or do you think that you can just build off of it and develop a different equal expertise?
I think there are different kinds of expertise, right? I take the example of driving a car. You can rent a car in almost any airport, and you're likely to get a different car each time you rent one. and you're able to hop into it and drive it, right? So the expertise you've developed there is how to drive a car. The exact mechanics of whether that uses a 6-cylinder engine or an electric motor does not matter as much. Yes, there might be some variations. I think in science, it's become increasingly complex. And you have to learn a lot to understand the full chain of things from, let's say, in neuroimaging, from acquisition all the way to analysis. Today, that might involve learning MR physics, sequence programming, experimental design, analysis tools which go from kind of pre-processing stages to statistics to machine learning, possibly deep learning. And imagine that space now. That would take multiple years for anyone to master. And I think what these open data and other things do is allow you to kind of go back to that question. Start with the question, start answering it, and then start digging in, because the assumptions that were made in collecting the data or processing the data may affect your question. And that's what might lead you to exploring that space of how did one do that analysis or pre-processing or processing? Do I need to redo it? So again, starting with the question, I think helps you control the space a little bit. But exploration and learning about new things, I think, should continue for life. So as long as one kind of sees through that lens, you can start with your question and then expand out from there. As opposed to, I need to know everything from how electrons move to how neural networks work to answer a question.
Yeah, thank you. So these public data sets and public tools make it easy for all sorts of people to play around and learn data, and then also build entirely new ideas and concepts out of them. Something, I guess, on the social aspects of it, we saw in the past year and a half that public availability of data, it gives a lot of people a chance to analyze and disseminate data. So I'm thinking of COVID dashboards or sorts of analysis of trends on case counts. And there was a time when it just seemed like, every person on Twitter had their own graph that they wanted to show, and maybe sometimes they weren't the most well-reasoned or there wasn't the most background for them. So what do you think is the response of individual scientists to have a fully have the good background, and to know that we're at a level where we can say something definitively, or as definitively as possible?
Oh, that's a hard question. I think in a lot of ways, anything that's put out there, whether it's preprints, publications, data, graphs, at some level, somebody is making assumptions about certain things, and many times those assumptions are not correct. I think openness is one of those things that helps you, as long as you're willing to put it out there, and somebody comes out and says, hey, because you put it out there, I was able to track this, and here is a bug in this, right? There are some famous cases of that in the economics literature, with decisions being taken at a country level that resulted from a bug in an Excel spreadsheet. So I don't think we're going to go away from that, but making things open allows the possibility of spotting that bug and rectifying it. I think the challenge for us is, just like publications, the amount of information has exploded because there is an easy way to put things out there. And how we filter it, the only way is to kind of increase our conceptual and analytical knowledge around the pieces that made that information go there. And this is where perhaps where expertise does come in, to be able to see something and say, oh, it does not compute. Can we look back at the details of this? And that's where openness does help, right? You can dig back into say, oh, this was done, this missed out this particular thing, or made this assumption. And those are the things I think it's difficult for us today to encode that alongside the outputs we produce. But if we did start doing that, or if we recognize what assumptions we were making, that might help change the dynamics of detecting those things earlier. But I think openness is good. Yes, we have to sort through a lot of noise, and that's getting more challenging. I don't know a good solution at this point in time, but I still think that should not take it away from people should not be able to put it out there.
Thank you. I have another question about openness. I'm wondering, maybe I'm wrong here, but I feel like sometimes when you get, I don't know, a professor position in an institution, they are going to require you to, or solicit you to use their own tools and programs. And I'm wondering if with openness, we can just use more, not just the tools from our institution, if that creates some kind of biases, and what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's related to that openness, as you said. I think anything that restricts takes away the possibility of exploring something else. Sometimes that restriction might be good, as in we have realized as a community that this is a good thing to do, right? When we talk about best practices, that's community consensus at this point in time that this is a good practice, and those are good. I have been lucky enough to be in institutions which have never had that kind of mindset, and I would say it's one of those things where today more than ever the ability to try out things, to do things, even if your institution or lab does not have those tools or frameworks set up, has significantly increased. You can go to the cloud and do a lot of things, even if your local workstation was restricted in some ways to do it towards certain sets of software. So that opportunity has increased. I don't think it's increased well enough. I think we've put a lot of focus right now, and rightly so, on getting data out there. I think a similar thing has to be done with getting derivatives out there, getting compute out there so that people can recognize if similar computation is being done, or access to computation. And I think that is happening in various, at least universities, slowly, where more undergrads are getting to participate in research projects. So they are getting exposed to a lot more things. The Google Summer of Code, which is a Google-sponsored program, has also kind of increased the amount of exposure students have had around the world to various projects. And these are really good things for the world and for trainees. All that being said, I would still kind of be on the side of open increases the openness of doors and gives you more access, and restrictions really prevent you from trying out other things.
Thank you. And related to that, do you believe that, for instance, somebody working in a specific institution where they don't have specific tools available could, do a whole career based on open tools and open data? Do you think that this is feasible, or this is a little bit not realistic?
It's somewhere between those two things right now. And that's because of what you might require the tools for. So not just having the tools, you might also need access to certain computational resources that you may not have in certain places. Imagine if the UK Biobank is a bad example in this case, because you obviously require a whole lot of other things to also fall in place to be able to access the data, to store the data, and to process the data at that scale. So it is with something like the ABCD. You need access, you need to be able to go somewhere and be able to process it. At least in the US, the NIH provides kind of cloud credits for people to process the ABCD data. So if you're looking to process data, you can get additional resources even if your lab does not have those resources. I can't say, I don't know every country on the planet, so there might be equivalent programs, but those are the kinds of things which increase, I think, not just access to data and tools, but the ability to use them together. and that may not be feasible on a laptop. The other way I would look at this is when people put out derivatives, they have already done a lot of the big processing, the heavy processing. And a lot of the statistical analysis, the relationship, the lightweight machine learning, you could do on a lot of open resources that are out there. So for example, again, I'll refer to our no-brainer project. We've created guides that anybody could use without a GPU, but they just do it through their browser online. Because Google Colab, which is what we're using, provides a GPU for people to play with these things online. So there's a lot of things that are possible today that would have been very difficult even 5-6 years back. And you can embrace a lot of these tools and technologies through these open resources.
So since we're about halfway through, or we're almost done with our time here, but we're about halfway through with OHBM, is there anything that you have seen that you are really excited about? Any particular tools or new data sets?
I mentioned the data set that you should go look at if you haven't, which is the data set from Oxford on ex vivo human brains, ex vivo primate brains, with MR and histology, whole brain diffusion. That was fairly exciting to kind of look at. So that's one. As with everything, I haven't had a chance to go through all the posters. But the ones I have seen have a lot of really cool things over there. So I don't want to bias everyone through just the lens of the things that I have seen. But we just did this poster highlight session earlier today, and for the neuroinformatics and data sharing section of OHBM. And so this data set came up. There were a couple of things on the usual ABCD, HBN data sets. What I would say is that I would take a step kind of outside of OHBM. The broader neuroscience community is producing data at a faster rate than ever before. And that's really amazing to see. And it's also amazing to see that many of these national initiatives are making that data accessible to many people. So today, if you're thinking of something, do ask that question. At OHBM itself, let's see. I forget sometimes what is new to me and what's new to someone else. And I think some of the things that I have seen, in this informatics space that's really new and really cool, do look at the UK Biobank. They're doing their second round of retest things, and that's bringing out a lot of cool scientific things. So chase Fidel and find out, and he'll be able to show you a bunch of cool things that he's doing with the new acquisition of data in the UK Biobank. I think that's giving us a much clearer sense of what at a large scale is repeatable, heritable, stable, and that's going to be a good thing for a lot of brain imaging stuff.
Absolutely, thanks. So just a few minutes left. What would your advice be just for any trainee or really any scientist who's looking to get into open science, but maybe is a little timid, and not sure if they can contribute? What is your best advice to get people to be more open?
Open science to me is about solving problems still. And so you can do that by just even asking the question. So once you are able to kind of connect with the community to say, here's a problem I have that I'd like to see solved, that will immediately kind of get you in, because there are people out there who might come in to help you solve those things. So that's one of the things. Don't be afraid to ask. The second thing is, yes, science or tools and technologies have become complex, but you don't have to know everything. You can start someplace and you can use the community as a way of learning new things. So participating in these brain hacks, participating in the OHBM hackathon, participating in other online things. Over the last year and a half, everything has been virtual. And that's been really, really good, right? for inclusivity and accessibility to a lot of things. So many people can come to these spaces and talk to others. In terms of openness about your own science, I think if you start with, I'm going to make sure that other people can replicate and reproduce what I have done. That's in your court, right? You have done the work, and that's a much easier step to kind of embracing that openness of science and technology. So I would say if those three things people did, we'd be in a pretty good place.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghosh, for all of your amazing insights and for this wonderful conversation and your presentation too. So I think we're going to stop here. We have less than a minute left. So once again, thank you so much for these great insights. And I don't know if you want to share some few last words to our audience before we close the call.
Just that, go support the student and postdoc SIG, participate in it, work with them. And thank you, Marianne and Kevin, for inviting me to this. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to chatting with you more offline.
Thank you, Satra. It's been a lot of fun. And thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks,
Enjoy
everybody.
HBM.